Greg, for those who haven't come across you online, introduce yourself and tell our listeners what we're talking about today.
My name is Greg Reybold. I'm the General Counsel and Vice President of Public Policy for the Georgia Pharmacy Association. We do a lot of work in the Georgia Capitol advocating for the profession of pharmacy, for the protection of patient rights, and a lot of that happens to be dealing with abuses and problems with pharmacy benefit managers.
Talking to good PBMs, usually the difference between the two is they say, well, Mike, we're a transparent PBM. We're not an opaque PBM. And that's where your problem is. And it's like, I'm not sure if I want a transparent PBM, then I can just watch them screwing me. I think I'd rather do that. I think I'd rather do that without seeing it.
Right.
It can't be that simple, just that we want to see stuff. Hopefully there's more protection for pharmacists than just seeing what they're doing wrong.
Right, absolutely. And I think there's some implications when a pharmacy benefit manager says that they're a transparent PBM. Implicitly in that often is that they're engaging in practices that aren't manipulative as well. Not always the case.
When the light shines on it, you're not supposed to just be doing terrible things still. That's supposed to clean things up.
I think that's right. But now what I would say is when we think we see some light shining on something in the prescription drug industry and PBMs, we're seeing slivers of light. We're certainly not seeing the whole picture.
It's sort of symbolic of cleaning things up.
Yes, I think that's right.
In these movies, let's say there's a detective movie, right? And every movie they have a scene of these guys going to the dark strip club, and having to pull out this guy and talk to him, and again, symbolism. It's like you think to yourself, that movie cliche of the strip club has to be the most degrading thing we can put on the screen, of degrading women and drinking and smoking. And is that a walk in the park compared to working with PBMs? Because the PBMs have really screwed people over, we have these terrible views in our head. But is there anything more seedy than a PBM, or do we just hate them that much because it's our industry?
It's a great question. An interesting analogy, right? So, in my head, when you picture sort of that movie scene, right, where it sort of represents the, the seedy underbelly of America, right? Like that's what they're trying to capture.
Yes.
There. And so, with regard to pharmacy benefit managers, obviously they are now amongst some of the biggest companies in the world, right? These are these are monster size companies. And look, there are big corporations, across industries, and the larger these corporations get, the more aggressive they're going to be, potentially the more comfortable with risk they're going to be. Certain practices they get so large. There may be some guy in a PBM who flips a switch, who's a numbers guy, who says, hey, listen, if we engage in this practice, we can monetize this thing even more, right? And so, there are all sorts of businesses when you get to a certain size that get really aggressive, and big decisions have to get made. And I'll give you, when I was in my first, I think it's my first year of law school, I remember something that was really eye-opening. This is a digression, but I'll bring it back quickly. But it was, it was a case study about an automobile manufacturer who essentially they knew that and I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but, if they sold 1 million cars, 1,000 were going to spontaneously combust and explode. And hey, of that, a lot of people are going to die. Do we bring it back? And you do the math, and it's like, lo and behold, hey, listen, X number of people are going to die. Let's call them 100. Of that, 50 are going to sue. Of that, 25 are going to, take a low settlement. We go to trial on some. But all in all, we're going to sell X number of cars. Let's roll them out, right? Let's sell those cars.
That was the old Pinto, right?
I don't remember.
You young kids don't remember that. Us old farts, that was the old Pinto. But that's the example they use. It's a numbers game.
Yeah, it's a numbers game, right? With prescription drugs, look, it's a massive market, right? Prescription drugs is big business. And frankly, you'd be hard pressed to find bigger business. And so what I mean by that is PBMs, obviously, you've got some huge companies, your CVS's, which bought Aetna, imagine that. You've got Express Scripts, which was bought by Cigna. But look at wholesalers, right? Wholesalers are in the 3 big wholesalers are, 2 of them, I think, are in the top 10. 3 of them are in the top 20, right? And so you start looking at the prescription drug market, and it's big business, right? And then you've got obviously huge pharma companies. Then you've got managed care companies that are, think Centene now, which before the Affordable Care Act wasn't on the Fortune 500, and now, I don't know their most recent placement, but they're well within the top 50, right? So, healthcare and prescription drugs in particular is big, big business. But what pharmacy benefit managers have done to me, and I always liken it to my father was an old Wall Street guy, and he engaged in arbitrage, right? And so, merger arbitrage, convertible bond arbitrage, and what is arbitrage, right? It's they're capitalizing on imbalances in marketplaces, and what pharmacy benefit managers have done is, arbitrage on the grandest scheme that it's ever been played, right? They create imbalance on every, almost every section of the drug equation. Right? They have found a way, the big ones, to manipulate and create imbalance every step of the way, and to then monetize that. And I don't know of another industry where you have these, just such giant companies with these just opaque and obscure practices that they've monetized it in the way that they have with prescription drugs. And I think what makes it more acute, frankly, is that this is something that's harming patients, right? It's certainly harming pharmacy. It's certainly harming the practice of pharmacy. It's certainly harming the business of pharmacy. But it's also harming patients. And look, I think when you look at larger healthcare insurers, and I think folks are looking at PBMs and like, hey, how can we replicate that elsewhere, right? And so, it's really truly a unique situation, pharmacy benefit managers and sort of the system that they've built. And we're playing in their world.
I ain't no genius, but I learned a couple years ago about weather more and about low pressure and high pressure. When you have low pressure, it allows the high pressure to come into the area, and that's why you get a change of weather. So it'd be like if a balloon has high pressure, it's always going to try to get its air out into lower pressure to equalize itself. And with the PBM, it seems like maybe every industry would do this, but in pharmacy, there's such a difference between pressures. There's such a difference between the arbitrage. It's just huge. And so as it balances out, it just looks terrible because it's such an imbalance.
That's a good analogy, I think, and there's just tremendous imbalance. But what they've done, maybe better than any other industry, and when I mean better, I mean worse, is, it's so complicated. It's so complicated, and every sort of each side is in the dark, right? This is what I do for a living, right? I'm a healthcare attorney, public policy person, but it is a tough thing to get a hold of because it's just, it's so massive, this system that they have built involving commercial payers, involving private payers, involving governmental payers. And it's so incredibly complicated. And, they found a way to exploit that. And, again, every step of the way, right? They're getting rebates from pharma to develop formularies. They're steering patients to pharmacies that they own. They're designing plans that do just that. With regard to reimbursements, obviously we're all, I'm sure your audience is well versed with like spread pricing and some of the things that have come out in that realm, right? And so, every step of the way, they're paying, charging their clients more, they're reimbursing pharmacies less, they're coming back on the back end. Even if you cut out spread pricing, that's all well and good. Hey, no more spread pricing, great. But guess what? They're coming back on the back end and they're imposing fees, right? And so, every step of the way, they manipulate that process. And what happens is, the business of pharmacy becomes more and more unsustainable every year. Patients are being impacted in the pocketbook every year. Their co-pays are manipulated because it's not the true price, of the drug when you get retroactive fees. Payers are paying more. Providers like oncologists and pharmacists are seeing that patient care is being compromised. But year over year over year, their profits grow and grow to the point where some of these companies are amongst the biggest companies truly in the world.
How the hell did pharmacy get so complicated? Is it because of all the players, or how did it get so opaque compared to, let's say, the car industry, for example?
Boy, yeah. Great question. And I hate to lay it all at the feet of pharmacy benefit managers, right? But they've evolved, right? And they've evolved quickly. And, you look at like the growth in DIR fees from 2010, right, to 2021. It's like, it's make believe numbers, right? And so, I don't know that I have a good answer for your question, frankly, other than, the system has been, this is by design.
It's been in the dark on purpose. Nobody wants to talk.
Yep, it's been in the dark, and frankly, in ways it remains in the dark. And look, pharmacies in certain ways were independent pharmacy in particular was the canary in the coal mine, right? They've been preaching about this stuff for. I remember when the first independent pharmacy I represented. They were preaching about the stuff for years before you saw really significant legislative action. In ways, it's a fascinating political story, and it wouldn't shock me. Look, I'm into it, and I'm nerdy about it. I love the issues and the subject. But look, it's an amazing political story of underdogs, small businesses standing up for their patients and for what their businesses and what they believe, and being able to make some significant strides. Right? I mean, it really is amazing. It's not easy to pass any law. Right, period. In any state, it's really easy to kill a bill. It's really hard to pass a bill. And if you look at the last 5 to 7 years, what pharmacy has been able to pass, in ways, it's a fantastic story of right. It's David and Goliath. It's these small independent pharmacy owners and small associations, and who are willing to come up against 40 contract lobbyists, 50 contract lobbyists, and it's folks who are on Main Street America, and legislators who are willing to listen to them and stand up to sort of these big behemoths. The problem is they evolve quicker than we do, right? And what I mean by that is we're always, for years, pharmacy was fighting audits, right? We're fighting audits, which are certainly a pressure point if you're a business owner. No question, right? It's a pressure point, an audit. But while pharmacy is worried about and fighting audits, they're sucking, half your patients out of the back door, and they're 9 steps ahead implementing DIR fees and practices of spread pricing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in ways, we've made amazing strides, and there's a lot of work in Georgia and nationwide that I'm super proud of, and it's really neat to see. But that said, pharmacy has to up its game more still, because these practices continue to evolve and evolve and evolve.
You followed the Me Too movement a few years back or whatever with these creepy Hollywood guys. I think that the only chance that pharmacy had of catching up with these scoundrels was the internet. People talking and LinkedIn and the podcasts and all this stuff. You say, you've got the audits, and then in that few minutes while we're arguing, they took 10,000 out the back door without us seeing them. And I think that the internet is the answer to shine, like we talked about, the symbolic transparency on this. And I don't think without the internet, we would be able to even come close to watching the back door.
I agree. It's a unique time in that the internet is out there, and the social media and the ways to communicate and the spotlight that does get shined on these practices is really amazing. Like, your podcast has brought a lot of attention to this. Antonio with 3 Axis Advisors, right? And the attention that he's gotten to these practices has been amazing. And APHA is shining a light, right? So and social media, it's spreading, right? But I think, pharmacy, and particularly not just independent pharmacy, but independent pharmacists have been amazing at really utilizing social media and technology to spread this message.
Speaking of Antonio, you kind of have that tough look. I look like an old fart, but you and Antonio are tough, good-looking guys. Remember The Right Stuff, or one of those movies where they show those 4 astronauts walking at you, It's got to be you and Antonio at least, and there's probably a bunch of other guys too, but you need to be the face of this.
You, my friend, just made my Christmas list, I can tell you that.
So we all just want to bitch about pricing, and we say we want it transparent, and we talked about that being the symbolism and so on. But now that I'm talking to an attorney here, what are some more specific problems with the PBMs rather than just a guy in the street like me saying we want to get paid more? For example, when I looked at Arkansas, it's like, oh, okay, well, they're fighting, but Georgia had some talking points in there or something. What are some of the details of this?
Yeah, so, I think big picture, and we can go narrow, right? But big picture, we've got to start fighting big fights. We've got to fight the right fights. We're never going to outspend them. That's for sure, right? So we've got to pick the right fights, we got to pick the right forums, and we have to do it precisely. I always say this: it's precision beats power.
Overall, we have to find a method, whatever the method is, but it's not going to be lobbying.
That's part of it, right? Advocacy is part of it, but whatever we do, we have to pick the right fights, and we have to do it aggressively, and we have to do it precisely, right? And look, it truly has evolved. When you look at, in 2014, 2015, the world was looking at audits. And when you start doing MAC pricing, in Georgia in 2017, we did, at the time, what was first of its kind, this Pharmacy Patient Protection Act, which is, hey, instead of going and talking about one really complex issue, let's get something on the books that's akin to unfair and deceptive trade practices, right? That's, hey, let's get a code section that says pharmacy benefit managers engage in bad practices, and those practices need to be stopped, right? Maybe it's mandatory mail order. Maybe it's gag clauses. Maybe it's copay clawbacks, which you may remember those, where a patient pays a $50 copay, but, the cash price of the drug was 20 and the PBM clause back 30, right? And so we got that on the books, and you start seeing that happen elsewhere. And then the next year, Arkansas does just some awesome stuff. Ohio obviously has done amazing things in Medicaid. Louisiana, there's so many states. And then what we started focusing on, I was really excited, and I believe this was the right fight, was steering in 2019. And we attacked steering kind of from a two-pronged analysis, right? Or sort of 2 points. One is, hey, PBMs, you shouldn't be able to engage in steering, right? It's harmful to patients. It's typically in healthcare, steering is persona non grata. You can't do it. PBMs have done it, again, on the grandest scale it's ever been done in the world in healthcare. So we attack it from the PBM side, but then we also attack it from the pharmacy side. And we say, hey, pharmacies, if you're affiliated with PBMs, if you share ownership, not only can the PBM not steer, but you can't fill it and bill it. And so, we started, because again, steering, I think, is one of the main issues.
And Greg, just for the listeners, so the steering is telling a patient you have to go to a certain pharmacy, and the pharmacies you're talking about is because of the vertical integration, the PBMs own these pharmacies. So it's like, wait a minute, because you own the pharmacy, for sure, you can't steer towards them.
Yeah, that's right. And so what we saw, and again, it was happening on a massive scale. It still is. But pharmacies that are owned by or affiliated with a pharmacy benefit manager, right? And you've got these PBMs who are first, and probably most insidiously, they're targeting the sickest patients across the country, right? Patients with cancer, patients fighting HIV, and who are on a lot of specialty drugs. And the PBMs are forcing these patients to get those drugs where? At pharmacies owned by them, often mail order pharmacies, right? It delays care. And again, I think if you look at like 3 Axis Advisors, have done amazing work on like prices and reimbursements in the specialty market. And what you'll find is, that's where the biggest profit margins are. That's why they're steering those drugs there, right? And they're engaging in those practices. And of course, then it goes not just from, this very specialty drugs, but also your maintenance meds, right? And so from a business perspective, if you're a small pharmacy, an independent pharmacy, heck, if you're a large chain pharmacy that's not affiliated, what are you left with, right? They've taken your sickest patients, they've taken your chronically ill patients, and they've left you with penicillin and ADHD. Right? That's so from a business perspective, obviously steering is incredibly anti-competitive, right? It's not allowing pharmacies to compete based on the care they provide. It's steering patients against their will. And that's what they're doing. And then from a patient care perspective, and I talk to oncologists weekly, and we work really closely with, the Oncology Association here in Georgia. And my God, right? You want to talk about sad and compelling stories of patients who, had to wait 3 weeks to get their drug. And then by the time it came, their blood levels were different. And, they had to wait another 3 weeks to get their drug, and the adverse impact of that, or patients trying to self-administer a drug or brown bagging. And so, it's an incredibly insidious practice, and it's an example of, I think, the larger problem. But I would say when you start tackling issues of, obviously you had, the MAC pricing, great. You see audits being tackled, and then you start, playing kind of in a bigger, let's go after more material things. And there's a lot of action in steering. There's no question about it. And so, that was great.
The audit and the MAC pricing was maybe low-hanging fruit, something like steering's deeper. And why is that?
Georgia, we've done a lot of work with audits and we've done a lot of work with MAC pricing. We passed it, I think in 2015 or 16, we passed a MAC pricing bill. And so it's not to devalue that work, right? I mean, it's all progress and it's all moving forward. But again, if you're worried over a $500 audit recoupment, which is maddening and wrong, but they're taking, all your chronically ill patients and all your patients fighting for their lives, what's left? Right? What's left when they can create a market? It's a bigger deal. I think it's more insidious. But here's the thing. It's fighting the right fights. And I think steering is a step towards that evolution. But to me, the big news out of PCMA v. Rutledge was huge, right? But my takeaway isn't, hey, everybody, let's go out and pass MAC laws. Mm-hmm. It's significant, right? If you have a MAC law on the books, all of a sudden, for the first time, we've got a green go light. Hey, this can get enforced in the commercial market.
Because that's what Rutledge was. That was more of a MAC thing.
Sure, right. That was Arkansas's MAC pricing law preempted by ERISA. So you've got the fully insured market and then the self-funded market. And so it gets complicated. But the takeaway was, hey, listen, states can, a state MAC law, Arkansas's MAC law, was enforceable in the ERISA market, including the self-funded market, right? And so, think large employer plans that are self-funding, and is that preempted by ERISA or isn't? The PCMA v. Rutledge, the Supreme Court says, hey, states can regulate that. But the takeaway isn't, hey, go pass a MAC law. If you look kind of deeper, that holding is, hey, listen, states can regulate costs. States can regulate costs. And so as a person who spends a lot of time thinking about this, it's great to regulate MAC pricing if that's what you've done. We've done it. Or if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But at the end of the day, we're still living in their world, right? And so what I would propose is, nationwide, if we're going out trying to pass MAC pricing, we're fighting the wrong fight, right? We're fighting the wrong fight because it's the deeper issue. It's not that, hey, they're not updating pricing. They're not. They're under reimbursing pharmacy. There's no question. But, if they evolve, right? So if it's not MAC pricing, it's GER pricing. If it's not GER pricing, it will be something else still, right? So I think pharmacy-wide, we have to look bigger. Right? Because, you stop the practice of MAC pricing, it's going to be something else. It's going to be something else. As long as PBMs are able to engage in sort of trade secreted reimbursement methodologies, we're going to lose. And we're always going to be a step behind.
You're not saying that we just have to take on something different now because they're going to change. You're saying that just the same as audits were maybe not as important overall as MAC pricing, you're saying now there's something deeper than MAC pricing, and that's something else. And then this can keep going deeper and deeper. What's the deepest?
I was joking around with my wife the other day, and I was like, I knew everything when I was 20, right? You know what I mean? Like the older I get, the less I know, right?
Right.
And so I certainly don't propose to have all the answers, but what I can tell you is, we've got to fight the right fights, and we've got to think bigger. And so we got to think bigger than audits. And we, just 2 years ago, we just completely rewrote our audit bill of rights. It was great. I think it's super strong, but we've got to think bigger across the board. And so to me, as a policy guy, as an attorney, I look at PCMA v. Rutledge. I'm like, hey, we can engage in cost. This is much broader than just MAC pricing, right? This is cost regulation. And so if everything that we do should be about almost deconstructing the system now, right? The system is so flawed and it's so broken. And I think we're at a unique time because pharmacy has a lot of integrity to its voice right now, right? The things that we've been saying for years, as folks look in and they see a little bit more, it's like, wow, hey, pharmacists were right. This spread pricing is nuts, right? The spread in Ohio was huge. The spread in Georgia was $50 million in a small Medicaid managed care market. We had one managed care company that had a 25% spread. So there's integrity. Think about that, 25% markup, right? So there's an integrity in pharmacy right now. It's a powerful voice. Pharmacy is always a powerful voice. Even if you look historically, pharmacists are held in really, really high regard. And so there's always power in pharmacists care for people. they're professionals and they're held in high regard. So it's always a powerful voice. But pharmacists helped expose these things, and you see these. Look at the work in Ohio with the large settlement with Centene, right? Yeah. And look at the spread pricing that we've uncovered. And so I think my thing is we've got to stop living in the PBM's world. And so I always use this, right? But like Plato's allegory of the cave, right? You got these folks looking at shadows. And they see a little bit of light. They don't like it, right? It's the shadow is their reality. And I think the PBMs have created this world of shadows, right? It's a world of shadows. It's a world of opaqueness. The fight shouldn't be, hey, update your MAC pricing. The fight should be there shouldn't be MAC pricing. That's the fight. The fight shouldn't be you got to update your MAC list. The fight should be there should be no MAC pricing. And again, I've fought those fights, right? I've fought for MAC pricing, so I'm not trying to disregard the work that's been done because it's been awesome and it's exciting. But I think pharmacy needs to start looking bigger, and I think they need to start fighting bigger fights.
So, for example, on the MAC pricing, you would say we're on the wrong fight. It shouldn't be how much you're going to allow this and that. It should be let's open it up. What is the price?
Yeah, right. And what's the answer? And those are hard questions. I would say, look, hey, how about you have NADAC is not a bad start, but it's certainly imperfect, right? But when you go into markets, like Alabama, I think, has sort of its own state specific, like NADAC, right? And NADAC nationwide and Medicaid, it's not mandatory reporting. So what do you have? You've got chains that don't report often and independents that do, and then that allows the chains to exploit the price based off of NADAC. But if you have sort of a transparent, a transparent start, that's a great start, right? So hey, all the drugs are going to be reimbursed on a actual acquisition cost plus model, right? Something like that. I'm not inventing that, to say the least, but that's a heck of a lot of a smarter fight than to be arguing over. Because again, if you get MAC, it's going to be called something. It's going to be whack, and then it's going to be TAC, and then it's going to be SAC.
Yeah, I've lived through it all.
We've got to start fighting bigger fights. The system, as long as we're sort of playing in their system and letting them define the terms. I used to have a great contract professor back in law school, right, who'd always say, hey, don't let anybody else define the terms, right? You define your own terms. And what we've done in pharmacy is we've let them set the field and we're playing in their world. And as long as we do that, ultimately, they're going to keep growing and growing and growing.
Remember Michael Jackson, his Super Bowl performance? So he got out there and he stood at midfield. He popped up from wherever Michael Jackson pops up, but he popped up with the smoke and so on. And he just stood there for 45 seconds and the crowd was going nuts, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there. And then he moved his head and then the crowd went wild again and he did for another 45 seconds. All right. So we've talked about the next thing. We've talked about don't make it MAC pricing. Make it just actual pricing, maybe under NADAC or something like that. All right. So you're Michael Jackson, and you're standing up there at halftime, and you get your first head move at 45 seconds, and then another head move 45 seconds later. What's your first thing you're going to say on that first head move? What's the next thing after pricing? And then what's the final deep thing? So you got two chances to go deep. What are they?
Can I have more than two? Come on, give me.
Well, how many do you want? No, two. I want this narrow. What's the final one you want to go for? The deepest. That's your head turn at 90 seconds. And what's your first head turn at 45 seconds? You get two.
On top of sort of deconstructing the whole reimbursement model being trade secreted.
Yes, let's say the whole reimbursement thing of the MAC pricing. We're not doing MAC anymore. We're doing whatever we want to do. That's one. What are your next two?
I'm going to give you a caveat because we've got Georgia specific and then national, right? And so there's some things that we've done in Georgia that I think we're poised to do some really exciting things. And then nationally, I think there's some different.
Do what you want, but you only get two.
You tackle sort of the reimbursement model, great, but you got two other problems. You got, I think rebates.
That's one.
Is a huge problem, and rebates need to be addressed in a huge way, right? Because ultimately they're pay to play, and they're a major leg that they stand on as a profit center, as a way to exclude competition, and patients suffer, and the whole system suffers. I think rebates is a major issue where there needs to be a lot of work done.
That's the 45-second one. What's your deepest one? You might have to skip over a few here, and we can come back to them. But what's your final, You're going to break into Billie Jean. You're about to break into that. What's your final answer?
On a national scale, I think addressing DIR fees, but in a very different way than the current solutions proposed have been.
DIR fees. All right. So that's the deepest. That's the biggest problem.
If you talk to any independent pharmacist, certainly DIR fees, and I talk to a lot that have closed, a lot that have sold, and DIR fees is a huge, huge pressure point.
Well, one of the reasons is because it's infinity. I mean, they can do it when they want to, as much as they want to. So that seems like a big hole to fill.
Sure. And I think if you look broader than just the impact on a pharmacy's bottom line, right? Because I think you've got to look broader, and it's a cancer to the whole system, right? It allows them to manipulate drug prices to payers to payers, because guess what? Most of that money isn't going back to the feds, right? They're keeping that.
Right. They can tell them what it was, and then they can legally then tell someone else what it was 7 months later or something.
Right. So it manipulates the price to the pharmacy, it manipulates the price to the payer, and it manipulates the price to the patient. And then on top of that, and I think this is a really another important reason it doesn't get addressed enough, right? But as long as we're fighting the fight that, hey, as long as we're living in their world and we're saying, hey, let's move it to the front end and not the back end, right? Again, I think it's the wrong fight. The price of a prescription drug, this is the Business of Pharmacy podcast, pharmacists do a lot. There's no question about it. They can improve care, and there's a lot of exciting work to do there. But as long as you tie the price of a prescription drug to patient outcomes, it's arbitrage, right? It allows them to manipulate the cost of a drug. So you asked me for two things, but really when you look at all three of these things, it's one. And what we have to do is break the system down so they can no longer profit on ambiguity, right? So they can no longer profit on imbalance. And how do you do that? You change the way prescription drugs are reimbursed, you take away rebates, and you take away DIR fees, you deconstruct the system. And the fight isn't, hey, in my opinion, and again, everybody's working hard in states and nationally, and I don't begrudge anybody anything, but if you're a business owner, right, should the fight be, hey, these EIR fees should be on the front end? Or should the fight be, you shouldn't tie the reimbursement of a drug to amorphous patient outcomes?
Is there any value in that of tying results to price?
Not to the price of a drug. The drug is the commodity, right? It has hard costs. And as long as they're able to sort of tie the price of a drug to amorphous patient outcomes, whether it's on the front end or whether it's on the back end, it allows them to manipulate the cost of drugs. And that's what has driven their growth, and that's what's been, the detriment to the pharmacy industry as a whole, right? We have to cut out their ability to play arbitrage, their ability to capitalize off of these imbalances. Pharmacists should get paid for the care that they provide, right? Pharmacists are healthcare providers. And so if you want to improve outcomes, and I think it's an exciting time in that area as well, right? I think folks are starting to open their eyes and they're realizing that, hey, pharmacists can play a central role in the great diseases of our time, right? Cardiovascular disease, diabetes. There's so much work that there is for pharmacy to do there that can improve these outcomes in Georgia and nationwide. And that's fantastic. But guess what? Pharmacists should be reimbursed for being a healthcare provider, right? Reimburse for outcomes. That's fantastic. That's great. That's what happens with every other provider.
As long as you don't have $1,000 medicine the person already took.
Right. Don't tie reimbursement to a drug to patient outcomes, period. It's a simple thing, right? It's a simple concept, but that's not what pharmacy-wide, we've not really been fighting for that, right? We're hey, don't do it on the back end, right? Don't do it. And so again, I think pharmacy-wide, we've got to start fighting the right fights. We've got to fight big fights, right. And we've got to rethink. We've got to stop playing on their field, right? They started the conversation. They're dominating with, hey, they're going to tie patient outcomes to drug reimbursement, right? And so where does pharmacy go? Pharmacy says, hey, don't do it retroactively. I think pharmacy should say, hey, don't do it, period.
It's kind of like my kids swimming, and I've got my youngest two now are 10 and 13, and they start fighting out in the water, and screaming back and forth. And I'm like, listen, you two, I'm not here to say who's right or wrong. If you guys are fighting, we're going to play a different game.
Yeah.
You're both getting out. You're both going to get out and sit there. And so if you don't want to both get out, find a way to work it out. No, and I get what you're saying. It's like they've got us into this weird game. They said, all right, here's the rules. Now talk amongst yourselves. It's like, no, that's the wrong conversation. We're having one not based on that anymore.
Well put. We need to change the game, right? Not try to put Band-Aids on sort of, and we've done this. And again, it's all great. It's all progress. And there's been great work done in a lot of states, and there's been great work done on a national level. But ultimately, we've got to stop having Band-Aid solutions, right? We need a different game. And if you look at, again, like I always brought to Ohio, I think Antonio's done, and others have done an awesome job, the coverage out there by the reporters. But, if you look at everything we know now nationally, there's one conclusion to me, and it's an obvious one: the system is broken, and we can't stop. Again, look, Georgia's done amazing work, right? And I'm proud of it. But the game goes on because we're playing their game, right? And so nationwide, we need to play by a different game, and that means we've got to rethink things. And it's hard. Change is hard. Change scares everybody, right? It's the world we live in, and that's why I go back to the allegory of the cave, right? We're comfortable with the shadows right now, right? It's a world that we're familiar with, and so that's the world where we play. But I think it's time nationwide to start fighting bigger fights. Maybe more coordinated, and let's stop it, right? We know all the games that's going on with rebates. We know all the games that goes on with reimbursement methodologies, and we know all the games that go on with DIR fees, right? Let's stop playing those games.
Let's say we all agree, and they make sense to me, rebates and then DIRs. How do you make that jump then? Are those two a pathway to getting out of the game, or are those just like, well, let's just do these two, but we still need to jump? How does that jump take place?
One thing we can take heart in is if you look at the work that's been done nationally, and I'm from Georgia, so I use, I'm the most familiar with Georgia, right? But if you look at 2015 to 2021, and you look at states like Arkansas, Ohio, Louisiana, New York, Georgia, I know I'm missing states, California. There's states that have done awesome work, Iowa. So I don't want to leave anybody out in that regard. But what we've proven nationwide is pharmacy can impact and change. In 1 year, it can be a different world in a state. Things naturally move faster at the state level, right? But again, we have to start picking big fights. And again, I think like steering was a big worthy fight, and I think that would also be part of it if you haven't achieved that already, right? But fight big fights. Don't be afraid to lose. Don't go for bunts, right? Swing for the fences, fight big fights, do it smartly, do our homework. But the data's there, right? The data's there. The system's broken. I think thanks to, the media and thanks to the work of pharmacists nationwide, people know it, right? Legislators know it. They know that there needs to be change, right? FTC, all of these things. And so, we've got to keep fighting, we've got to keep driving those conversations. We've got to keep driving the narrative, but we've got to introduce legislation that tackles big things.
So, Greg, would it be fair to say that these bigger fights, even if they don't get us out of the game, what they're doing is they're announcing to the world how screwed up everything is. And then it's saying, look, we showed you how screwed up this was. We showed you how screwed up that was. Do you finally trust us enough to say that we're not going to play this game anymore? And then someone says, all right, you showed us how messed up it was. All right, what is your new game? Is that kind of like it is? Maybe these fights are not getting us into a new game, but they're showing the world how messed up this is.
Yeah, I think certainly the fights expose the practices, right? There's no question about it. And so the fights should be fought, win or lose. Those fights are out there. They're big fights, and those fights should be fought. But I do think, if you're in a world where all of a sudden rebates aren't driving formularies and you don't have pay to play and you've got sort of a transparent acquisition cost that everybody knows, and folks are choosing pharmacies based on the quality of care, not based on these narrow networks and rebate games, and you take away these DIR fees or whatever you want to call them, where performance is performance and patient outcomes are tied to reimbursement of a drug. Guess what? those are fights that do change the game, period, right? PBMs, hey, they want to be, they're comfortable if as long as you're living in the world of trade secret methodologies and you're talking about, hey, let's force them to update it. Even if they lose, they still win, right? If we're saying, hey, you can engage in DIR fees or, performance tied to drug reimbursement tied to patient outcomes, but you have to do it on the front end, they're still going to win that game. And, the rebate game, they Lord knows they win that one too, right? And so, those fights will change the game, as does steering. Because again, what is steering but another way for them to clout things, right? Is it? We see this in lots of states. These conversations of, hey, we should be able to incentivize a patient to use our pharmacy, right? If we offer zero copay at our pharmacy, that's an incentive. Don't take that away. Well, no. It's not an incentive, it's a penalty. If it's a penalty for them to use the pharmacy of their choice, right? It's not an incentive, it's a penalty. And so steering is just another example of that, right? It's they utilize it obviously to steer business, but also to manipulate what is the cost of a drug, what is the price. And so we've got to take that playing field away from them. And I think those are the ways to do it, to fight those big fights broadly.
We level things out, we make it more transparent, we get rid of all the games and all that kind of stuff. Then the PBMs keep dropping the reimbursement. You can see everything now and it's more upfront and all that. Tell me where that link is to say, all right, but it's not this game anymore. Even though it cleans it up, how does that jump us to not having it based on the product versus the care? Is it because customers then, because they're not being forced to go anywhere, I can see, well, if they're not being forced to go to a chain, maybe they'll come to my pharmacy, but if I'm not getting paid enough for it, they might see some of the services, but not all of them I could give. How does that get us to the new game?
Keep in mind, one of sort of the pillars, if you will, that they stand on is these sort of obscure, quote, trade secreted reimbursement methodologies, right? And so, if you have a simpler cost plus system, and PBMs have to reimburse at whatever the state average acquisition cost or actual average acquisition cost plus dispensing fee, right? I think that's going to take a lot of the a lot of the problems in terms of just absurd underwater reimbursements out, right? It's not a perfect world, but if you go to if you look at Medicaid fee for service, where a pharmacy is paid NADAC plus a fair dispensing fee, right? It's a simple concept, but you don't see those pressure points. You don't see pharmacies getting killed with the underwater reimbursements. It's, when you take away the trade secret methodology, that's what empowers them to just kill on the reimbursement side.
Gotcha. So if there's a little bit of breathing room there, then pharmacists can maybe start to do their thing and come back to life a little bit.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing to imagine, right? Because the system is so skewed right now, right? But there are other ways of doing things. And let me add this, right? I'm not proposing that these are the sole answers, but what I can tell you is we need to think bigger. And we need to be more aggressive, and we need to think differently, right? We need to find different angles. And look, I don't know these guys, but I'm a fan from afar, right? But like Blueberry Pharmacy, right, out in Pennsylvania, right? They reimagined a different way to do it, right? And they took PBMs out, and there's a way for them to make a decent living, provide fantastic patient care, and save patients money. And why? Because every step of the way in the current system, PBMs have the ability to manipulate and profit off of that uncertainty. So when you get a transparent model for reimbursement, and then you take away their ability to manipulate that on the DIR fee patient outcome side, and you take away their ability to manipulate formularies, et cetera, on the rebate side, and then you don't let them steer, I think what we're going to see is pharmacies practicing pharmacy again.
I had Kyle on the show from Blueberry back a couple months ago. And once a lot of this stuff is cleaned up, and then finally people have freedom, and then he's $3 more than someone else, it's like he probably won't lose that person for those $3. He would have lost them if CVS or someone came in and said you had to leave. But for those $3, a person probably won't leave. I always use the example of getting cancer. It's like, let me hold on for 6 months and something might happen. But it sounds like these big fights are kind of at least giving some life before everybody's wiped out, giving some life and giving a chance. And neither you nor I have the answers right offhand, but give us at least a fighting chance to get into a different game.
Yeah, I think so. At a state level, I think, what Arkansas did with PCMA v. Rutledge was really important, and I think we need to see more fights there, right? Like Georgia's passed a lot of things. Some of them are great. Some of them, not all of them are great, but some really interesting things. And we're seeing them adhered to in, 50, 60% of the market. So I think there's also a lot of action in fighting to ensure that state laws that get passed are enforced broadly across other markets as well. And so, and I know that's a little bit of a digression, but it's a point that I wanted to get out, because it's one thing to kind of pass these things and get these things on the books, and it's another thing to get them enforced. And there's a lot of work to do there as well. But boy, PCMA v. Rutledge was an awesome, major step in the right direction for that.
Once a state brings something and they win, like in the Supreme Court, is it best for you, like with Georgia, to say, hey, that's already won, let's not go back and do that? Is it better for 50 states to all fight something different because we can all benefit from the win of an individual state?
So that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for you. What I can tell you is PCMA v. Rutledge was really unique because it made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which is a big deal, right? Not every case does. And so, something that happens in the 8th Circuit, which is where Arkansas is not binding precedent in the 11th Circuit, right? And so, but obviously a case like that, for Supreme Court case, I think what is decided for certain is that, states can engage in cost regulation beyond just MAC pricing. And so, again, I think we need to think bigger than just a MAC pricing law based off of that precedent, right? But look, PCMA and who's the PBM Association and PBMs, they're gonna construe that decision narrowly, right? And so, and pharmacy is probably going to construe it broadly. So there's a lot more fights, right? Are PBM regulations across the board not preempted by ERISA, or is it just cost regulation? And so you're going to see some significant fights, right? And keep in mind that ERISA, PCMA v. Rutledge at the Supreme Court level, they were looking at the issue of ERISA, right? Self-funded, employer plans, right? Whether they're fully insured, whether they're self-funded, the ERISA market. They weren't looking at the Supreme Court at the Medicare market, right? And are state laws preempted by the Medicare Act? If a state outlaws or prohibits DIR fees, right? Does the Medicare Act preempt that? The Medicare Act preempts, where there's established standards. Is there an established standard on DIR fees? Isn't there? Established standard on audits? Established standard on steering? And so there's a lot of fights to fight. And so certainly, the issue of cost regulation, that's been decided. It's been decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, cost regulation in the ERISA market. But there's a lot, I think there's great work to do in Georgia and other places in terms of, hey, let's get some of our laws enforced in broader markets, right? Can we get it enforced in the Medicare market? What beyond ERISA, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to do. It's a really, to my mind, it's a really exciting time, and pharmacy has enjoyed, fantastic success when you look at the, the fights and like the dollars that PBMs can spend and the number of lobbyists that PBMs can hire. It's a fascinating, if you kind of take a step back, it's a fascinating political dynamic, and it shows the power of advocacy and the power of pharmacy to be able to bring, the biggest companies in the world, to their knees and state legislators at times.
Rutledge and your wins. Has anything changed? I mean, can you point to something and say, our state now is doing this? Because we say we bring these PBMs to their knees. I know legally we do, but can we point to any changes?
It's a great question. And when I say that, I don't want to be hyperbolic, right? But, for pharmacy to beat PBMs in the U.S. Supreme Court, that's a big deal, right? It's a big deal. And we're going to grow on that.
And I want it to be a big deal. I'm just like so pessimistic against those bastards.
Yeah. I can point to a lot of examples where patients are coming back into pharmacies. Patients are coming back into oncology clinics in Georgia because of Georgia's steering law. Are all of them coming back? No. But you know what? If oncology clinics are able to treat 50% more of their patients now and care for them in a better way because of those laws, you're darn right that's worthwhile. It absolutely is.
When we were talking steering, I was thinking, all right, we're talking about goals and so on, but you guys have won some steering laws?
Yeah. So in Georgia, we've, in 2019 and 2020, we did some expansive legislation, and steering was a big part of what we tackled. And so those laws are on the books and they're strong, and there's other states that are also implementing steering laws. And so does it make a difference? Yes, it does. We also did, one of the big issues going back like 5, 6, 7 years, and it probably still in some states is you pass a law, but there's no hook, there's no enforcement.
Yeah.
And if you want to go and complain, the PBM can point to, hey, guess what? We've got an arbitration clause and we've got a choice of law clause. And it ain't Georgia if you're in Georgia, right?
It's got to be fought in another state.
Right. And so that's a way for them to get away from different state laws. But so we've done a lot of work on getting in Georgia, the Commissioner of Insurance has oversight. He has ability to, he has equitable powers to stop practices. He's got powers, to implement fines, licensure, also to order reimbursement to pharmacies, as well as pay fines to pharmacies. And so, there's always a lot of work to do. We're certainly not getting our laws adhered to in 100% of the market, but we are getting them adhered to in large swaths of the market. And I think that means something. And we're not the only state, right? There's other states that are doing that. So these fights have to be fought. And again, now there's other fights we can have in terms of what's the scope of it. If Arkansas had never passed their MAC law, they wouldn't have been able to get to the U.S. Supreme Court to fight over the scope. And so, what we should see is these MAC laws now, these prices being updated in the commercial market, the ERISA market as well. And so that's a really good thing. Again, my premise is states shouldn't go past MAC laws, but they should think differently now that we know that hey, states can regulate cost in the ERISA market.
It seems to me that the states, and a lot of times people bitch about this because it's something against them, like, oh, they made me get a license for this or to do that. But if something passes in the state, it seems they have a lot of power over a business to say, well, I don't care who you are. You can be the biggest company in the world, but if we don't allow this to happen in our state, we don't. Now, I suppose the company, like I'm thinking of like Amazon, I suppose the state could make a law against any Amazon purchases coming into a state, but I suppose then Amazon could probably sue the state, right?
Sure, and ultimately that's what PCMA v. Rutledge was, right? PCMA sued the state of Arkansas. But in healthcare, and particularly in insurance, states can move quickly when you have, and again, we've had great champions in Georgia. Representative David Knight is just an amazing pharmacy advocate, and Senator Burke and Senator Watson, Representative Cooper, and what we're seeing is in more and more states there are folks who are fighting for pharmacy, right? In your Arkansas, all over the country, New York, there are folks who've picked up the mantle and they're fighting those fights. But the PBMs have armies of lawyers, and they're expert at trying to argue preemption arguments, whether it's ERISA preemption, whether it's Medicare preemption, whether it's TRICARE preemption, but they find ways to not adhere to it. And so there's part of the battle is getting the law in the books. Part two is getting it enforced, right? And so, but coming off of PCMA v. Rutledge, there's never been a better time to try to get state PBM laws enforced.
Yeah. I read an article last week and I was actually pretty enthused by it. One of the states, the court said that the contract that they signed, it was a bad contract, and thus the PBM could not enforce it against the pharmacy. Now, I'm always thinking, I don't think it's fair this, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's fair that the PBM is making us do this, but it's like, well, I'm the dumb schmuck that signed the contract. Maybe it was through a PSAO or something, right, but I'm the dummy that signed it. And so I got to live with it. And that was very strange to me thinking that even though a pharmacy signed something, the court said that they weren't held to that because it wasn't a fair contract. And I was like, I didn't even know that existed. I thought if you signed a contract, no matter how unfair it is, you're just screwed by it.
Right. And so, look, there's so many different angles, and advocacy and legislation is certainly one angle. Regulatory work is another angle, what you see like the national groups doing with CMS. But there's a lot of really good lawyers out there, too, who are tackling this from a litigation angle. And contract is certainly one of them. Are there arguments that these are contracts of adhesion? Certainly. Are there arguments that there's no meeting of the minds because the pharmacy didn't even see the contract that it's being bound to? Yeah, right. And so, there's really neat work being done, in courts right now. There's at the regulatory level, and then of course advocacy, at state and national level too. And so those are all really good things. And so overall, I think it's if you're an independent pharmacist, like hey, or pharmacist period, right? If you're in pharmacy, because you have chains that are non-PBM affiliates that also want to see a lot of these changes. And so I think, it's got to be in ways a breath of fresh air. But the flip side is you're a pharmacy owner who's behind that counter. And are you feeling change? And I don't know the answer to that, right? For me, these things I know that they're wrong, and I feel it in my bones, and I believe it to my core. But some of these things are esoteric because I'm not behind the counter filling prescriptions at losses or having to tell patients, hey, you have to go to this mail order pharmacy to get it filled, or having, a quarter, $100,000 recouped, because of retroactive, right? I'm not behind the counter. And so it's easy for me to say, hey, look at all these great things going on. We should be encouraged and pick up the mantle and go forth, right? Because you're behind the counter and you're feeling it and you're seeing it. And hopefully some of this stuff is translating. But, what I would posit to you is, this is the time to push, right? And this is the time. And I always say this too, I think it was an old plumbing adage that turned into an old boxing adage, and I use it in politics a lot, right? But pressure bust pipes. And this is the time for pharmacy and patients and oncology and other providers. This is the time to apply pressure and let's get as much change as we can. This is the time is ripe.
I've been around a long time, and in my mind, pharmacy is getting more wins right now than ever. Then I say to myself, all right, let's look at this critically. Is it because I'm talking to more people with the podcast? Is it because social media, I'm seeing it more, but more is not being done, but I'm just reading more about the different pharmacy associations? Is it because PBMs have gotten so nasty exponentially? We look like we're exponential, but we're actually at a lower curve than they are. But it seems to me like we're making progress more than, let's say, 3 years ago. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think we're evolving and we are seeing progress more and more. And I don't know that you can point to one or two things, but I think you can certainly point to the work is being done, right? It's being done by associations. It's being done by some other organizations, some buying groups. The work is being done. And I think another factor is the PBMs have greed at the level that maybe we've not seen in healthcare, right? And what's the old pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered, right? Like, they're not sympathetic, right? And the work that's been done to expose these practices is starting to pay dividends. But again, there's more work to do, right? And in Georgia too, right? We had a fantastic 2019. We had a fantastic 2020. We rewrote the PBM code. We prohibited spread pricing at the state level for state plans, for counties, for cities, right? But again, that's still a Band-Aid, right? Because we're still in Georgia living in their world in a lot of ways. And so yes. There's progress being made, but there's a lot more work to do. There's a lot of momentum, but this is the time to push, right? And this will have a direct impact on patients. It'll have a direct impact on payers. This is the Business of Pharmacy podcast, right? It'll have a direct impact on the business of pharmacy, right? There's no question about it.
I think that the natural extension of social media, it doesn't just happen by us getting on here and bitching to each other. I think the connection, though, is it lets people know they're not alone, that there's a fight, and maybe 10% of it or 20% of it help find an address or talked about let's meet down at the Capitol today or, something like that. I think there's some mechanical help of it, but I think 80 or 90% of it is just people feeling like they're not alone and me seeing, oh, Georgia won and the Supreme Court thing won, and things like that. I think it brings some hope maybe for then people to hit the ground and do something with their legislatures and so on.
You bet.
So, Greg, 10 years from now, where are you personally?
Hopefully healthy, right?
I already told you that you've got the magazine cover with Antonio, so I'm not going to give you another compliment there. You'll be healthy.
No, look, in terms of this industry, I'm not going anywhere, right? I mean, this is where my career is and my passion is, and so I don't know what fights we'll be fighting. But I can tell you that there's no finish lines in this, right? There's we've talked a lot about PBMs and their relation to the business side of pharmacy, but there's just a lot of exciting work to do. Whether it's getting pharmacists reimbursed for outcomes and improving patient outcomes. There's a lot of great work to do. And I always, because this is a business pharmacy podcast, I always used to tease when I was in private practice. I represented a lot of pharmacies, and I wasn't one of these lawyers, right? But most lawyers don't pick up the phone if they're not billing for it. And I always laugh because there's not an industry that gives away more than pharmacy, right? Like, it's funny, but it's not funny, right? Pharmacists do so much and they don't monetize
anything, right?
A tenth of it, right? And so that's why I get excited when I see like the Blueberry pharmacies and some of these other things out there, because like in Georgia, pharmacists can absolutely, it's in the law, pharmacists can bill for pharmacy care services, right? But do they? Right? Like pharmacy gives away so much. And so on top of fighting these PBM fights, I think there's great work to do in getting pharmacists to figure more centrally in these big diseases and getting pharmacists reimbursed for that work. And I think that's a win-win, right? It's a win for pharmacy, it's a win for payers, and it's a win for patients. And so there's great work being done nationally on that too now, right? And so it's an exciting time to be in pharmacy from that perspective. And in 10 years, again, I hopefully we will have fixed some of these things and we're working on some more of the fun stuff too. But there's no finish lines.
Yeah, on your point about charging, I was talking to one of my podcast guests, and they were saying that there was this very obvious thing that a pharmacist should charge for. I forget what it was. It was very obvious, and the pharmacist actually quit or something before they would charge for something. I forget what it was. It's crazy.
Free delivery, free consultations, free, everything is free. Whereas in the law, and you don't know this yet, but I'll be sending you a bill for this, right? No, I'm just kidding.
Nice talking to you, Greg. Take care.
But everything is right. In most businesses, everything is monetized. It's funny, but it's not, right? Because pharmacy needs to get better and evolve in terms of billing and getting reimbursed for their expertise. Because the expertise that pharmacists have is immense, and it's central to improving outcomes. Georgia, if you look at Georgia's Medicaid managed care patient outcomes, right? All these there's so many not all, but there's a number of categories where Georgia's in the bottom 25% in the nation, dealing with things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and asthma, right? And so but where patients are struggling just so happen to be where pharmacists are great if folks start to really utilize and unleash the skill that pharmacists have to battle these big diseases. So
I tell my team that the biggest killer of people is, let's say, heart disease and cancer. It's there's a lot that can be done and a lot that people will pay for if you do it right.
Yeah.
How many state associations have a full-time attorney on staff? Do you think it's a lot?
I don't know. I'm sure there's some, but I think when you get to the nationals, that's where typically, more consistently you'll see attorneys involved, certainly.
It was interesting. I'm not going to say the religion, but I was just on TikTok last night and they were going through this one denomination and they were saying, look at this historian for this denomination. He was an attorney. And now look at the previous historian for this denomination. they were an attorney. And now look at the previous one, they were an attorney. And he said, isn't it odd that for the historian role, they didn't have a historian on there? So there was a reason why they had attorneys, because there was probably something they didn't want to come out about the,
right, yeah, that's right.
the denomination. Now, I'm not looking at Georgia shifty just because they have a full-time attorney in there by any means. Well, Greg, keep up the fight. Thanks for what you're doing and the gusto and the hope that you're bringing to the conversation. And I think that's needed as much as anything.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, I think that's, there's no one thing that I think points to pharmacy's success, but we have to keep fighting hard. We've got momentum in a way that probably we've never had before. And again, I think sort of the games of PBMs have been exposed, amazing work out of Ohio and Antonio for that, right? But like their practices have just been so exposed now. And then you come off PCMA v. Rutledge. It's an exciting time. We've got to fight hard, but we've got to fight big fights and smart fights. And it's going to be a neat few years, I think.
What's something that someone listening to this week they could do? Let's say they're hearing this right now and it's a pharmacist. What could they do? Whether it's learning something or writing to somebody or supporting something, what's a word of advice you could give just so someone doesn't say, oh, that's great, and then they're not doing anything? What could they do?
Yeah, and I'm gonna be broad, not myopic, and it's fight, right? Find a way to fight. And so if you're in a state that doesn't have a lot of PBM laws, get involved in a state association, talk to a legislator, have a legislator visit your pharmacy. I hate saying it because it sounds cliche, right? But that's what drives this stuff, right? When you get somebody who's willing to come and listen and they see it. And I don't know too many folks who've actually taken the time to see it, to see what pharmacies deal with and see what patients deal with, who've walked away and not wanted to do anything. Right. And so maybe that's how you fight. I always say this, right? Like so many pharmacists, and this isn't specific to pharmacy, right? But everybody wants to fight until it's time to fight. Right. And so whether it's, being willing to go down and offer testimony, right? There's a handful of folks who are willing to come down and share their experiences. And we've been lucky in Georgia because we've had a lot who are willing to. When we get the law on the books, be willing to file a complaint. Right? Be willing to fight that, right? Because it's there's a million different ways to fight. Maybe not a million, but there's a lot of different ways to fight. But you've got to be willing to do it, right? And the folks who step forward, they've been a part of great change, right? We had a pharmacist, Jen Shannon, Lily's Pharmacy, who's just awesome and a good friend, and she came down to the CVS Aetna merger, and she was willing to share her experience and testify. And we got some really, really significant preconditions as a result of that testimony. We've had a ton of pharmacists come down to the Georgia Capitol and share their experiences. And it's those experiences, those narratives that drive change. And so, if you're a pharmacist, get involved and find a way to fight. And it may be as simple as a pharmacy visit. It may be filing a complaint. It may be willing to testify. It may be writing a letter. And you know what else? Being willing to speak up and disagree, right? Pharmacy, one thing I think industry-wide, pharmacists are like the nicest people, right? And so, when we go one direction, everybody goes that direction, and nobody wants to say, hey, maybe we should turn, maybe we should, right? And if you see a better way of doing things, or if you have ideas, share those, right? Don't, because, your perspectives are really, really valuable, but it's just willing to do something, willing to take that step, and willing to fight the fight in whatever capacity you're willing to do it. If if it's donating to a PAC, if it's donating to a legal defense fund, all of those things are help move the ball forward. And so if you want to see change, be willing to fight for that change.
My wife was a teacher, so I always pick on teachers that the reason they've got such good unions and such good benefits and so on is because they sit around the teachers lounge and they complain to each other, and in a closed door teachers lounge, they're like, oh my gosh, we got the best career in the world, but let's not let anybody know about it. Let's go out and say that we actually take work home at 3 p.m. and we don't get to actually stop till 5 because we're working from home. It's like, well, yeah, no other profession does that. They've got this whole thing set up. But pharmacists, I like that one about filing a complaint. So instead of maybe pharmacists just bitching to each other or bitching online, they'd say, hey, this PBM doesn't seem to be following this new law that our state has. I'm going to write to the state.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, look, again, Georgia's what I know, so we'll use Georgia, right? But we've got Commissioner of Insurance oversight. We've got, really strong regulations on the books on top of the laws. The commissioner is empowered to take action. But, when I talk to somebody from the Commissioners of Insurance, and I say, hey, I'm hearing lots of examples still of steering or underwater reimbursements. And they'll say, hey, we're not seeing that, right? Like we're not, the complaints aren't coming in. And so, and again, pharmacists are incredibly busy, and I get that, but that's part of it, right? That's part two to the equation, right? You get these laws on the books, but again, PBMs are sophisticated operators, and they may say, hey, if we engage in this practice 5,000 times, but we know historically that there's going to be 3 pharmacies that complain, and we can, mea culpa it, or sorry, here's a reimbursement. Well, they still did really, really well, right? And so until their feet get held to the fire, they'll keep doing these things oftentimes. And so again, if you're in a state where you're lucky enough to have some laws on the books, hold their feet to the fire.
Who does a pharmacist send a complaint to?
So obviously it may be different in different states, right? But in Georgia, we've got wide PBM laws on the books and regulations, and they can go to the Commissioner of Insurance's website, and they can go to the Consumer Complaint Bureau, and they can file a complaint. Really easy. We also have, again, like steering on the Board of Pharmacy side, so they can file a complaint, or a patient can file a complaint with the Board of Pharmacy also, if they're being steered and having their prescription filled by an affiliated pharmacy. So, there are places to go in Georgia, certainly, but are there a lot of complaints being filed? Not that many.
Yeah, I think I found my new purpose. I can be a professional complainer. All right, Greg, thanks for everything.
Yes, it's been my pleasure, and thank you for having me and the work you're doing.
We'll be watching, and thanks for Georgia's leadership. We're all behind you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much.